A chill wind snakes up Raven's Peak just after dawn, carrying with it a low, humming fog that clings to the pines and drapes the ridge in damp gray. 5 hikers, Mara, Jonah, Celeste, Raphael, and Lynn, pause at the trail junction, peering into the suffocating haze. The cairns they followed all morning have vanished. Even the cheerful ribbon markers on the hardwood trunks are swallowed by swirling mist. Mara checks her GPS watch, but the screen flickers and dies in the cold. "We must be close," she says, voice tight. The summit's only a half-mile. Jonah's breath puffs in ragged bursts as he stamps each booted foot against a mossy outcrop. "But I don't remember the path turning that sharply," he mutters. Celeste scrapes her gloved hand across damp bark, seeking the red and white stripe they tied yesterday at each fork. But the stripe is gone. The bark is knee-deep in glistening emerald moss, soaked through by the fog's incessant drip. Lynn, the smallest of the group, shivers. "I'm scared," she admits, voice cracking like dry twigs underfoot. Raphael kneels to scoop up a handful of the moss with his gloved palm. "At least the ground is soft," he offers, though his eyes dart toward the steep slope they must have crossed hours ago. "Just stay close." They move forward in single file, boots sinking into the spongy carpet, unaware that each step presses a new track into the vapor-laden earth. The only sound beyond their careful panning is the drip of condensation from needles overhead and the faint whisper of wind through the pines, as if the mountain itself is murmuring warnings. Suddenly, Lynn stumbles over a root and catches herself against a fallen log. There, gleaming in the muted light, is a slender ribbon of silvery slime stretching across the wood's moss-covered surface. "Look," Lynn breathes, pointing. At the far end of the ribbon sits the tiniest creature any of them have noticed on this rugged trail. A garden snail, its amber shell spiraled with delicate bands, moving forward in measured inches. Celeste crouches beside it, heart pounding. What is a snail doing up here? And how did it follow our path? She watches as the snail extends its tentacles, tasting the air, then glides onward, leaving a luminous trail that catches the dim light like spun glass. For a long moment, no one speaks, each hiker lost in the snail's quiet tenacity. Then, Mara exhales. Maybe it knows something we don't. She stands, brushing damp hair from her forehead. Now let's follow it. They line up behind the snail, boots returning to the moss at the exact points where its slime has smoothed the ground. The forest feels different now, somehow alive with purpose. The trees leaning in, the mist parting in the snail's wake, and the ridge itself seeming to open a hidden passage. With cautious hope, the hikers set off, stepping carefully into the snail's glimmering path. Each footfall a silent promise to trust the smallest guide on mossy ridge. And as they follow the spiral shell vanishing into the gray, they realize their journey has become something more than a scramble to the summit. It has become a lesson in finding direction in the most unexpected places. Mara's heart thudded against her ribs as she rose to her feet, brushing damp moss from her palms. Before her, the tiny snail, a mottled amber spiral no larger than a silver dollar, pressed onward, its silvery mucus ribbon glinting like a fragile lifeline through the gray veil. Mara swallowed hard. "Follow it," she breathed, and the others flinched at her sudden resolve. Jonah knelt beside her, squinting at the snail's path. "Are we really going to trust that?" His voice trembled, half in awe, half in disbelief. Mara met his gaze. "We have no choice. Everything else has failed." She gestured to the blank map screens on their GPS devices and the vanished trail markers. "This snail has found a way." Celeste exhaled, voice tight. "It moves at a snail's pace," she complained. But even as the words left her lips, she took the first hesitant step onto the shimmering line. Her boot contacted the moss exactly where the slime trail lay, a faint glide of slickness underfoot that felt oddly reassuring. She paused, heel against toe, and then followed as the snail extended its body forward, tentacles probing the misty air. Raphael and Lynn exchanged worried glances, but Lynn resolved with steady determination. She crouched, scooped a small stone, and laid it gently beside the trail as a marker. "If we lose sight," she said, "we'll know where to start again." Mara nodded, impressed by Lynn's quiet courage. The group fell in single file, each footfall imprinted on the moss, precisely where the snail's trail had smoothed the ground, the scent of wet lichen rising with every step. They moved through the forest in silence, save for the soft scrape of their boots and the snail's rhythmic glide. The fog swirled around them, parting in gentle eddies along the slime ribbon as if the snail's passage carved a corridor through the mist. Overhead, black-capped chickadees darted along bare branches, flashing white cheeks in curious inspection before flitting away into the haze. Beneath the undergrowth, the hush was absolute. No rustle, no call, only the snail's tireless advance. After 10 minutes, the snail approached a tangle of brambles that would have trapped boots and torn clothing. Its slender foot paused at the thorn-laced barrier, then it curled its body into an arch, planting itself on a knobbly root. The slime glistened like wet glass on the root's wood grain. Mara stepped forward, mentally mapping the root's contours to guide her crossing. Inch by careful inch she advanced, her studs gripping the slippery moss. Celeste followed, her arms braced against the brambles as the snail uncurled and resumed its path across a fallen log. Jonah watched, awe silencing his earlier doubt. I never thought I'd say this, he murmured, but that snail just saved us from a nasty tumble. He tested the log with a toe, found it secure, and stepped onto the snail's slick surface. Lynn and Raphael joined, forming a human chain as they crossed together. Beyond the log, the snail's trail led them toward a low rock ledge. Here, the moss gave way to icy stone that would have jammed their boots. But the snail's slime strip shimmered, and each hiker gingerly followed its path, edge by edge, until they reached the other side unscathed. Mara watched the snail's movements with growing admiration, how it sensed the microgradients of moisture, how it avoided puddles of icy water, how its tiny foot glowed with confidence. At the ledge's end, the snail paused before a steep slope slick with moss and frost. It angled its shell toward an inconspicuous fork in the ridge, one branch leading upward toward jagged rocks, the other descending into thicker fog. With a deliberate movement, it chose the descent. Mara exhaled, steadying panic in her chest. Downhill it is, she said softly, and the group exchanged determined nods. Together they followed their diminutive guide into the descending path, hearts buoyed by hope and minds humbled by the snail's silent expertise. In that moment, they understood that guidance sometimes comes in the smallest of forms, and that trust, once given, can illuminate even the most uncertain journey. Fog lay thick as soup at ground level, wrapping the underbrush in a damp embrace. The hikers pressed forward behind the snail's lustrous trail, each step careful to place their soles in the exact groove of glistening slime. The forest floor was a mosaic of slick leaves and spongy moss, punctuated by upturned roots and decaying logs that threatened to trip unwary boots. Mara led the way, eyes trained on the slime ribbon winding between ferns. At her ankle, Celeste muttered, "Watch that hollow." Beneath a tangle of brambles lay a hidden sinkhole, an ice-cold puddle half covered by a feeble crust of leaves. The snail's trail arched gracefully around the rim, hugging the firmer earth. Jonah followed its curve, his crampon tips biting into solid ground. When Samira skidded at the edge, the snail's next segment veered left, and she sidestepped safely. They entered a thicket of saplings whose slender trunks formed a natural maze. Each gap was barely 2 feet wide, tight for human shoulders. The snail slipped through, curling its shell to deflect thorny branches. Mara mirrored its path. She planted a hand on each sapling, inching through the narrow corridor, careful not to snag her pack straps. Raphael and Lynn followed, their jackets brushing past smooth bark rather than gashing on sharp twigs. Beyond the thicket lay a fallen Douglas fir, its trunk coated in emerald lichen. Mossy and rotting, it would have been impossible to cross, except for the snail's path, which spiraled up a knot in the wood where the surface remained firm. Each inch of slime glowed like a beacon. Mara tested the knot with her foot, found purchase, and stepped up. The others clambered over in single file, boots never leaving the snail's guiding line. A sudden drip of water from above sent a spray of droplets across the path. Celeste's hair plastered to her brow as the snail continued unperturbed, its next segment leading beneath a broad, overhanging rock. The overhang sheltered a section of compressed pine needles, an almost invisible bridge over a narrow trench. The snail's trail bisected it. Mara hopped across, hearing only a faint crunch of needles, rather than plunging into frigid water. As the trench ended, the forest opened onto a small clearing where the fog glowed faintly silver. The snail paused beside a cluster of mushrooms, the only patch of dry soil for yards around. It curved around the caps, marking a path between two nearly hidden sinkholes where water had pooled in shallow craters. Following its lead, the hikers stepped from one dry patch to the next until they stood on solid ground once more. Behind them, the labyrinth of the underbrush lay silent. The snail's slimy line faded into the mist ahead, pointing the way to yet another trial, the creek crossing that waited on the other side of the thicket. But for now, the hikers exhaled, hearts light with gratitude. Each deliberate groove of slime had steered them clear of hidden dangers and unpredictable falls, transforming the thicket's perils into a safe, snail-navigated passage. By the time the hikers emerged from the tangle of underbrush, the fog had grown thinner, revealing the distant murmur of rushing water. Through the thinning mist, they saw a swollen creek cutting across their path, its dark waters frothing with snowmelt. Fallen logs and slippery stones made a natural bridge, but the torrent's roar and the ice-encrusted surfaces promised treacherous footing. Mara held up a gloved hand. The snail's trail leads across, she said, pointing to a faint ribbon of slime glistening on the nearest log. The snail had paused at the creek's edge, tentacles quivering as it assessed the crossing. Along the root-woven bank, the slime line traced a narrow route, onto the log's smooth top, across the midstream boulders, then up a mossy stone on the opposite shore. Jonah crouched to inspect the log. Its bark was stripped smooth by years of water and ice, but where the snail had passed, the slime had created a thin, almost invisible film that would provide a fraction more grip. Jonah's breath caught at the sight of the rushing water beneath, nearly a meter below, and he tested the log with a cautious toe tap. The wood held firm, and the slime-slick path narrowed like a tightrope. "Follow it exactly," Mara instructed, voice calm but firm. "One at a time." She stepped onto the log's edge, arms outstretched. The cold spray spattered her boots as she inched forward, each step guided by the snail's faint trail. Her crampons bit into the slick wood, the snail's slime clinging to the metal studs, cutting the log's slipperiness by half. With a small exhalation, she reached the first moss-covered boulder emerging from the water's churn. Celeste went next, her jacket brushing the log's side. She placed her foot in the snail's groove, felt the security of the tacky film, and leapt to the boulder. Jonah followed, and then Raphael, each movement steady, each footfall secure. When Samira hesitated at the first jump, the snail's body had already begun its slow crawl across the boulders, an unspoken encouragement to trust its path. Samira gripped her hiking poles, bent her knees, and sprang, placing her feet within the slime's narrowing ribbon. Lynn, smallest and lightest, waited on the bank, heart pounding as she watched. Celeste offered her a reassuring smile. "I'll watch where the snail goes," she said, and Lynn nodded. When she approached, Lynn leaned forward, headlamp catching the snail's translucent trail. She slid both poles onto the log beside the slime line for balance, then placed her boots carefully, following the snail's exact pattern until she reached the river's opposite edge. With all five across, they paused on solid ground, boots echoing on the stone with triumphant clacks. Behind them, the creek roiled silently, as though bewildered that its crossing had been commandeered by something so small. Mara knelt to touch the water, lifting droplets to her lips. The air tasted of earth and melting frost, a fresh promise for the final stretch. The snail had disappeared into a thicket of alders across the creek, its trail vanishing into a narrow chute between trunks. As the hikers gathered around, Jonah found a freshly broken branch and laid it alongside the trail, ensuring that any who followed could easily spot the crossing. With the creek behind them, the air brightened and the ridgeline sloped gently upward toward a faint glow on the horizon, the warming promise of the main summit path. Each hiker felt renewed strength, buoyed by the knowledge that, in the snail's tiny gleaming ribbon, they had found the one sure guide across the forest's most dangerous obstacle. And as they set off together, boots once again pressed into the snail's shimmering line, they carried within them a new respect for the tiniest of navigators, whose slow, steadfast trail had bridged the gap between danger and safety. The world held its breath as the first pale ribbon of sunlight pierced the fog, turning droplets on needles and moss into a million trembling jewels. Where only minutes before the hikers had waded through a featureless gray, now outlines emerged. The bristling pines of the summit ridge, the gentle arc of the valley below, and, most welcome of all, the familiar stone cairn marking the junction of the main trail. Mara pressed her palm against a wet boulder at the ridge's lip, feeling its solid warmth as the sun's rays banished the last vestiges of mist. Behind her, Jonah slid to his knees in the mossy carpet and scooped up a handful of sparkling dew, letting it trickle between his fingers. "We made it," he whispered, voice thick with relief. The others clustered close, each tracing the snail's shimmering line one final time with their eyes, where it led them out of danger and into dawn's forgiving light. Celeste, cheeks flushed, brushed a strand of damp hair from her face and laughed, a clear, joyous sound that echoed down into the valley. "I never thought I'd follow a snail to safety," she admitted, kneeling beside the last slug of slime that crept beneath a tuft of sunlit grass. She bent to scoop up a smooth pebble, pressing it gently onto the ribbon like a bookmark in their story, a token to remember how even the smallest path can guide you home. Raphael leaned against the cairn's pile of stones, gazing down the slope where the main trail wound back toward parking and rescue. He exhaled a long breath, the tension of fear draining from his shoulders. "We'll sign the register today," he said, "but our real thanks goes to our tiny guide." He glanced back to where the snail had disappeared under a new shoot of grass, its amber shell catching the sun before vanishing into the undergrowth. Lynn sat on a low rock, pulling off one boot to examine the sole. There, faint imprinted in the mud, were still the dappling patterns of the snail's glide, proof that they had not followed a hallucination but a living navigator. She traced the slimy line with a fingertip, then pressed her palm to the trail. "Goodbye, friend," she sighed softly, "and thank you for leading us true." Together they rose and stepped onto the well-trodden path, the cairn's red and white ribbons once again guiding their steps. As they descended toward the safety of Trail's End, the sun climbed higher, the fog dispersed entirely, and Raven's Peak stood unveiled in all its grandeur. Below, the valley flooded with morning light, and far off, cars idled in the lot where worried friends and rangers would soon greet them. In their hearts, the five carried a new understanding, that guidance comes in many forms, and that courage sometimes means trusting the smallest, quietest of allies. And though the snail would never know the depth of their gratitude, its slimy ribbon remained etched into their memories, an unbreakable line of hope that would light their way whenever they next wandered into life's fog.